The Russian Empire on the brink of revolution, late 19th century, 1917. Imagine a vast empire stretching across 11 time zones, from the frozen tundras of Siberia to the bustling streets of St. Petersburg. The Russian Empire of the late 19th century was a land of staggering contrasts, immense wealth and crushing poverty, rapid innovation juxtaposed with rigid traditions, and burgeoning revolutionary ideas simmering beneath a veneer of imperial control. At this time, Russia was a nation teetering on the precipice of profound transformation, a society caught between the feudal legacies of the past and the industrial future that threatened to upend everything. Industrialization had arrived unevenly. Major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg buzzed with new factories, railways, and modern infrastructure. But the countryside remained largely unchanged, with peasants still bound by remnants of serfdom and struggling to eke out a living from the land. Urban workers labored under harsh conditions in factories, enduring long hours, low wages, and unsafe environments. In this climate of inequality and exploitation, discontent grew, fueling the rise of radical political ideologies including socialism and Marxism, which promised a fairer distribution of wealth and power. Among the young intellectuals who embraced these revolutionary ideas was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, later known as Lenin. Born in 1870 in the provincial city of Simbirsk, Lenin's early life was marked by both privilege and tragedy. His father was an educated bureaucrat, yet his family would face profound sorrow. The execution of his elder brother for plotting against Tsar Alexander III left an indelible mark on Lenin, shaping his unwavering determination to overthrow the autocracy. Lenin immersed himself in revolutionary theory, studying the works of Marx and Engels, and committed himself to a radical transformation of Russian society, believing that only a determined vanguard could lead the working class to power. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 intensified Russia's internal crisis. The war drained the empire's resources, caused devastating losses on the battlefield, and left millions of soldiers wounded or dead. Meanwhile, the economy faltered, food shortages worsened, and inflation skyrocketed, leaving the civilian population desperate. Tsar Nicholas II's leadership was increasingly questioned, and by February 1917, widespread strikes, protests, and mutinies culminated in the February Revolution, forcing the abdication of the Tsar. A provisional government assumed power, but it struggled to maintain order, failing to address land reform, the needs of workers, or Russia's ongoing participation in the war. Into this chaos stepped Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who promised peace, land, and bread. Lenin returned from exile in April 1917, presenting a clear vision for Russia: the overthrow of the provisional government and the establishment of a socialist state. By October, the Bolsheviks orchestrated a nearly bloodless coup in Petrograd, seizing control of the government and setting the stage for the creation of the Soviet Union. The early months of Bolshevik rule were marked by immense challenges. Civil war erupted almost immediately as the Red Army, loyal to Lenin, clashed with the White Army, a coalition of monarchists, conservatives, and foreign-backed forces. This conflict devastated the country, leaving millions dead and cities in ruin. Lenin and his closest allies, including Leon Trotsky, implemented war communism to sustain the Red Army, nationalizing factories and requisitioning grain from peasants. While these measures ensured survival, they caused widespread hardship, famine, and resistance, illustrating the brutal reality of revolutionary governance. By 1921, the Civil War had ended, leaving Russia exhausted and impoverished. Lenin introduced the new economic policy (NEP), allowing limited private enterprise to revive the economy and provide a measure of relief to citizens. At the same time, the Communist Party consolidated its power, establishing a centralized one-party system enforced by the secret police, the Cheka. Lenin's vision of a socialist state was realized in structure, if not yet in widespread prosperity, and by December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics (USSR) was officially formed, uniting Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian republics under a federal socialist government. Stalin and the rise of the Soviet Union 1924-1939. Lenin's death in 1924 left the Soviet Union at a critical crossroads. The revolution had triumphed, the Civil War had ended, and the new socialist state existed on paper, but questions of leadership and direction loomed large. Within the Communist Party, a fierce struggle for power erupted, pitting ideologues and revolutionaries against each other in a battle that would determine the USSR's trajectory for decades. Two figures rose to prominence during this period: Leon Trotsky, the charismatic and intellectually brilliant military strategist, and Joseph Stalin, a cunning and calculating party bureaucrat. Trotsky, widely admired for his oratory and revolutionary credentials, envisioned the spread of socialism on a global scale. He argued that the survival of the Soviet state depended on inspiring and supporting revolutions abroad. Stalin, however, advocated socialism in one country, asserting that the USSR must consolidate power and modernize internally before pursuing international revolution. Through skillful political maneuvering, alliances, and bureaucratic control, Stalin gradually outmaneuvered his rivals. Trotsky was eventually exiled in 1929, leaving Stalin as the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. With control firmly in his hands, Stalin embarked on a radical and often ruthless campaign to transform Soviet society, reshape the economy, and consolidate political authority. Stalin's first priority was industrialization. The Soviet Union remained largely agrarian, with much of the population engaged in subsistence farming. To compete with industrialized nations like Germany, Britain, and the United States, Stalin implemented a series of ambitious five-year plans, directing the state to control every aspect of the economy. Factories, railways, and infrastructure sprang up across the nation, often in harsh environments where workers endured long hours, strict quotas, and grueling conditions. Failure to meet production targets could result in imprisonment, exile to labor camps, or execution. Simultaneously, Stalin pursued collectivization of agriculture. Individual farms were forcibly merged into large state-controlled collectives. Resistance from peasants was met with severe repression, including mass arrests, deportations, and executions. Grain requisitioning policies prioritized feeding the growing urban workforce and exporting surplus for industrial machinery. These measures precipitated widespread famine, most devastatingly in Ukraine, where the Holodomor claimed millions of lives. The brutality of collectivization illustrated the human cost of rapid economic transformation under a totalitarian regime. Political control under Stalin was absolute. The NKVD, the secret police, monitored and eliminated perceived enemies of the state. The Great Purge of the late 1930s decimated the Communist Party, military leadership, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens accused of sabotage or counter-revolutionary activity. Public trials, forced confessions, and mass executions spread terror, ensuring compliance and consolidating Stalin's authority. Fear permeated every level of society. The act of speaking against the state, even privately, could have fatal consequences. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, everyday life for Soviet citizens continued in a mixture of resilience, hardship, and propaganda-driven optimism. Education and literacy programs expanded while the state promoted the model Soviet citizen, disciplined, loyal, and devoted to collective goals. Arts and literature were strictly controlled through the doctrine of socialist realism, depicting heroic workers, soldiers, and peasants while silencing dissenting voices. Science, industry, and technology were emphasized, and ambitious projects such as the Dnieper hydroelectric station symbolized national progress and pride. By the late 1930s, Stalin had transformed the USSR into a centralized, industrialized, and militarily powerful nation, but one characterized by pervasive surveillance, fear, and repression. The stage was set for one of the most significant and devastating conflicts in human history, World War II. World War II and the Soviet Union 1939-1945. By 1939, the Soviet Union, under Stalin's iron grip, had become a formidable power on the international stage. Industrialized, militarized, and centralized, the USSR appeared ready to face the turbulent global currents of the late 1930s. Yet despite its power, the world teetered on the brink of another catastrophic conflict, the Second World War. In August 1939, in a move that shocked the international community, the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. This pact allowed Stalin valuable time to prepare the nation for the coming storm. The Soviets took control of eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Finland in the months following the agreement, consolidating territorial gains and strategically positioning the Red Army. However, the alliance with Germany was fragile and temporary. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive surprise invasion that shattered any illusions of security. Over 3 million German soldiers poured into Soviet territory along a 1,800-mile front, targeting key cities, industrial centers, and communication hubs. The early months were catastrophic. The Red Army, caught off guard, suffered staggering losses in both manpower and equipment. Cities fell rapidly, and millions of civilians faced the horrors of occupation, forced labor, and mass executions. Despite the initial setbacks, the resilience of the Soviet people was extraordinary. Entire factories were dismantled and relocated east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of advancing German forces. Citizens mobilized for the war effort. Men fought on the front lines, while women served as nurses, pilots, snipers, and factory workers. Children collected scrap metal, grew food in urban gardens, and learned to endure bombings and rationing. Ordinary people became extraordinary, their daily lives intertwined with the fate of the nation. The siege of Leningrad, lasting nearly 900 days, became one of the most infamous episodes of human endurance in the war. Starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, yet the city refused to surrender. Families subsisted on minimal rations, and yet the spirit of resistance persisted through acts of courage, art, and clandestine cultural activity. Similarly, the Battle of Stalingrad from 1942 to 1943 became a turning point of unprecedented scale and intensity. Soviet troops, facing brutal street-to-street fighting, managed to hold the city and eventually encircle the German Sixth Army, marking the beginning of the Red Army's relentless westward push. War permeated every aspect of Soviet life. Propaganda glorified heroism, sacrifice, and the collective struggle, motivating citizens to endure unimaginable hardships. Education, healthcare, and social services were repurposed to support the war effort. Science and technology advanced rapidly under wartime conditions. Tanks, aircraft, weapons, and medical innovations were produced in record numbers. Despite the extraordinary mobilization, the human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest over 20 million Soviet citizens, both soldiers and civilians, lost their lives during the conflict. Cities lay in ruins, agricultural production collapsed, and infrastructure was devastated. Yet through this immense suffering, the Soviet Union emerged not only victorious but also as a dominant global power. The Red Army's final advance into Eastern Europe and the capture of Berlin in 1945 cemented the USSR's role as a decisive actor in defeating Nazi Germany. The war left an indelible mark on Soviet society. The trauma and heroism of the conflict became central to the collective memory, influencing culture, politics, and ideology for decades. The war also accelerated social changes. Women's participation in the workforce and military expanded dramatically, challenging traditional gender roles. Wartime industrialization laid the groundwork for post-war economic reconstruction, while scientific and technical advances accelerated, particularly in aviation, rocketry, and nuclear research. At the same time, the sheer scale of loss, displacement, and destruction left deep psychological scars, creating a population simultaneously resilient, wary, and dependent on state authority for security and survival. By 1945, the Soviet Union had survived its greatest trial, but the end of the war did not signal peace in the global sense. A new era was dawning, a Cold War defined by ideological struggle, military rivalry, and political maneuvering. The devastation wrought by the conflict necessitated a comprehensive reconstruction of the economy, infrastructure, and social systems, while the USSR sought to assert itself as a global superpower. Post-war reconstruction and the early Cold War 1945-1964, the guns fell silent in 1945, but the Soviet Union faced a new and equally formidable battle, rebuilding a nation devastated by 6 years of total war while simultaneously asserting itself on the emerging global stage. The Second World War had left cities in ruins, infrastructure shattered, and millions of families bereft of homes, food, and basic resources. Yet the USSR, battered but unbroken, embarked on a massive program of reconstruction under Stalin's leadership. Stalin's post-war priorities were clear: industrial and agricultural reconstruction, consolidation of political control, and expansion of Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. Heavy industry became the backbone of the economy, with an emphasis on steel production, coal mining, and machine building. Railways, roads, and power stations were rebuilt at a relentless pace, and urban centers rose from the ashes with new apartment blocks and factories designed to propel the Soviet Union toward economic modernization. The human cost of reconstruction remained high. Labor shortages were acute, as millions of soldiers had perished and displaced populations struggled to return home. Gulag prisoners and forced labor were sometimes utilized to accelerate reconstruction projects. Citizens faced rationing, shortages, and overwork, yet the Soviet narrative celebrated collective effort, heroism, and patriotic sacrifice, encouraging endurance and compliance despite the hardships. While the USSR rebuilt internally, Stalin also focused on establishing a buffer zone of influence in Eastern Europe. Satellite states were created in Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Governments loyal to Moscow were installed, opposition suppressed, and economies integrated into a Soviet-controlled bloc. The Iron Curtain, famously described by Winston Churchill in 1946, descended across the continent, symbolizing the emerging ideological and geopolitical divide between East and West. The Cold War was born out of this post-war environment. Tensions with the United States and its allies escalated quickly, driven by mutual suspicion, competing ideologies, and the race for strategic advantage. The Marshall Plan, which provided economic aid to Western Europe, was viewed by Soviet leaders as a tool of American influence and was rejected. In response, the USSR intensified control over its satellite states, creating Comecon to coordinate economic activity within the Eastern Bloc and counter Western initiatives. Life for ordinary citizens during this period was a mixture of hardship and progress. Housing remained a pressing issue, with urban populations living in cramped utilitarian apartments. Consumer goods were limited, rationing continued in some areas, and the quality of food, clothing, and household items often fell short of need. Employment was guaranteed, providing a measure of economic security, but wages were low, and career advancement required political conformity and loyalty to the Communist Party. Education and healthcare were priorities for the state. Literacy rates approached 100%, and schools emphasized technical skills, scientific knowledge, and Marxist-Leninist ideology. Universities expanded rapidly, producing engineers, scientists, and technicians to serve the industrial and military sectors. Healthcare, while free and theoretically universal, suffered from uneven distribution of resources and personnel, particularly in rural areas. Despite these challenges, many citizens took pride in a system that provided access to essential services. Cultural life was tightly controlled. Socialist realism remained the guiding artistic doctrine, emphasizing heroic laborers, soldiers, and scientists. Literature, theater, cinema, and visual arts glorified the state, the party, and the achievements of socialism. At the same time, underground and samizdat culture persisted quietly. Dissident writers, artists, and intellectuals circulated forbidden works, challenging official narratives and preserving independent thought. Music, theater, and literature became subtle spaces for critique and reflection, even under pervasive censorship. In 1953, Stalin died, leaving a nation fearful of instability. His death triggered a power struggle, eventually leading to Nikita Khrushchev's rise to leadership. Khrushchev's period, known as the Khrushchev Thaw, introduced cautious reforms and a loosening of some of the strictures imposed during Stalin's rule. He publicly denounced Stalin's cult of personality and the purges, a process known as dissolution. Political prisoners were released, some policies were relaxed, and cultural life experienced a modest expansion. Khrushchev also pursued bold economic and technological initiatives. He launched the Virgin Lands campaign, aimed at increasing agricultural production by cultivating previously unused lands in Kazakhstan and Siberia. The campaign had mixed results, initially boosting grain output but ultimately facing environmental and logistical challenges. Khrushchev prioritized industrial modernization and technological innovation, accelerating the development of jet aircraft, nuclear technology, and missile systems. Perhaps the most dramatic achievement of Khrushchev's era came in 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. This achievement shocked the United States and marked the beginning of the space race, becoming a symbol of Soviet scientific prowess and national pride. The launch of Sputnik and subsequent space missions, including the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin in 1961, was celebrated as victories of socialism and evidence of the USSR's technological superiority. However, life for ordinary citizens remained constrained by shortages, rationing, and centralized economic planning. Housing was still inadequate, consumer goods scarce, and political conformity expected. Propaganda emphasized collective achievement, heroism, and loyalty to the state, while dissent or criticism was met with surveillance, censorship, or social marginalization. Despite these restrictions, many Soviets experienced a sense of optimism during Khrushchev's thaw, hoping for a more open, prosperous, and modern society. The Cold War continued to shape the Soviet Union's international and domestic priorities. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, illustrating the high stakes of superpower rivalry. Diplomacy, espionage, military buildup, and ideological competition became central to Soviet strategy. At the same time, resistance within the party and bureaucracy increased as Khrushchev's reforms disrupted established hierarchies. By 1964, Khrushchev was ousted, replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, ushering in a period of political stability, centralization, and relative stagnation. While Brezhnev's era would later be characterized by economic slowdown and bureaucratic rigidity, the foundations of the modern Soviet state industrial power, scientific achievement, and global influence had been solidly established during the immediate post-war period and Khrushchev's reforms. Brezhnev era and stagnation 1964-1985. By 1964, the Soviet Union had entered a new phase under Leonid Brezhnev, following the removal of Nikita Khrushchev. Brezhnev's leadership marked a period often described as the era of stagnation. Politically, the system emphasized stability, centralization, and continuity rather than reform or innovation. Bureaucratic structures grew more rigid, and leadership was increasingly dominated by aging party elites. While this brought a sense of predictability to the Soviet citizen, it also stifled initiative, slowed economic growth, and created a growing gap between public expectations and state capabilities. The Soviet Union remained a global superpower. Its economy, heavily industrialized and militarized, continued to support a massive military space program and nuclear arsenal. The Cold War dominated foreign policy, with the USSR maintaining its satellite states in Eastern Europe and extending influence across the developing world through ideological, political, and military support. Conflicts in Afghanistan, Angola, and elsewhere highlighted the USSR's willingness to project power, though these ventures often strained resources and created long-term challenges. For ordinary citizens, daily life during the Brezhnev era was a mixture of security, predictability, and stagnation. Employment was guaranteed, and most people could expect stable if modest incomes. However, shortages of consumer goods persisted, rationing remained common for certain items, and housing, while improved compared to the post-war years, often failed to meet demand. Standardized Khrushchevka apartments were common in cities, emphasizing functionality over comfort. Families made these spaces their own, creating warmth and community despite constraints. Work life was strictly organized. Factories, offices, and collective farms operated under rigid schedules, with quotas and targets monitored by party authorities. While guaranteed employment provided stability, incentives for innovation or efficiency were limited. Political conformity was expected, and career advancement often required loyalty to the Communist Party rather than exceptional performance. Education and healthcare continued to be central pillars of Soviet society. Literacy rates were nearly universal, and schools emphasized technical skills, scientific knowledge, and ideological training in Marxism-Leninism. Universities produced engineers, doctors, and specialists to support the industrial and scientific base of the state. Healthcare remained free, though quality and access varied by region, with rural areas often underserved. Cultural life in the Brezhnev era was tightly controlled. Socialist realism remained the official artistic doctrine, emphasizing heroic workers, soldiers, and scientists. Films, literature, and visual arts glorified the achievements of socialism and reinforced the ideological narrative of the state. Underground culture persisted, however, as dissident writers, artists, and intellectuals circulated samizdat, self-published works challenging the official narrative. Music, theater, and literature became subtle spaces for critique and reflection, even under pervasive censorship. Propaganda remained omnipresent, shaping both perception and reality. Posters celebrated labor heroes, smiling children, and the might of the Soviet military. Public celebrations marked May Day, Victory Day, and anniversaries of the October Revolution, reinforcing collective identity and loyalty. Despite the omnipresence of state messaging, citizens often navigated a dual reality: outward compliance and private skepticism. Social life in the Brezhnev era was deeply communal. Families, neighborhoods, and workplaces formed networks of mutual support. Citizens relied on personal connections to access scarce goods, secure housing, or navigate bureaucratic hurdles. Community life was often vibrant, even within the constraints imposed by the state, with shared celebrations, cultural gatherings, and informal networks helping people endure shortages and limitations. Economically, the Brezhnev period was marked by stagnation. Centralized planning continued to focus on heavy industry and military production, often at the expense of consumer goods, agriculture, and technological innovation. Agricultural inefficiency persisted, and productivity growth slowed. Corruption and bureaucratic inertia undermined economic effectiveness, while the centralized system struggled to adapt to new challenges or modernize rapidly. Internationally, the Soviet Union remained a dominant player. The Cold War reached new heights of tension during the 1970s, with arms races, proxy conflicts, and diplomatic confrontations defining global politics. The Cuban Missile Crisis remained a cautionary memory, and the USSR continued to invest heavily in nuclear and conventional military capabilities. The space race continued, with milestones such as the Salyut space stations and advances in satellite technology reinforcing Soviet prestige. Despite the challenges of stagnation, many citizens maintained pride in the Soviet system. Scientific achievements, industrial accomplishments, and the collective memory of victory in World War II provided a sense of continuity and resilience. Ordinary people found ways to adapt and thrive within the constraints of the system, cultivating small personal gardens, engaging in informal trade, and forming networks of mutual support. Religious and national identities persisted beneath the surface of Soviet society. While the state promoted atheism and sought to suppress religious institutions, underground communities continued to practice faith, and national identities in Ukraine, the Baltic states, and the Caucasus preserved cultural traditions. These undercurrents of identity would later become central to the transformations of the Gorbachev era and the eventual dissolution of the USSR. By the early 1980s, it was clear that the Brezhnev system was faltering. Economic growth had slowed dramatically, technological innovation lagged behind the West, and the rigid bureaucracy stifled creativity and responsiveness. The population, long accustomed to scarcity and state control, began to grow restless. Young people, intellectuals, and workers alike were increasingly aware of the contrast between Soviet life and the prosperity of Western nations. The Brezhnev era, for all its stability and predictability, had created a society simultaneously proud, resilient, and constrained. The foundations of Soviet power remained formidable, but the cracks in the system, economic stagnation, bureaucratic rigidity, and social pressures were becoming impossible to ignore. The stage was set for a new leader, a new vision, and a period of dramatic reform that would confront the Soviet Union's deepest structural weaknesses. Gorbachev reform and the fall of the Soviet Union 1985-1991. By 1985, the Soviet Union had reached a pivotal crossroads. After decades of industrial achievement, scientific progress, and global influence, the system was faltering. Economic stagnation, bureaucratic rigidity, and political inertia had weakened the foundations of the state. Citizens, long accustomed to scarcity and control, were growing restless. Into this environment stepped Mikhail Gorbachev, a reform-minded leader who believed that the Soviet Union could be renewed without abandoning socialism, but whose policies would inadvertently accelerate the unraveling of the state. Gorbachev introduced two transformative policies: perestroika restructuring and glasnost openness. Perestroika aimed to modernize the economy, decentralize some state controls, and encourage limited private enterprise. State-owned enterprises were given more autonomy, and cooperatives were permitted in sectors such as services, small-scale manufacturing, and agriculture. The goal was to improve efficiency, stimulate productivity, and revive a flagging economy. Glasnost, meanwhile, promoted greater transparency, freedom of speech, and public discussion of the Soviet Union's problems. For the first time in decades, citizens could openly criticize corruption, inefficiency, and historical injustices without immediate fear of repression. Previously banned books were published, investigative journalism emerged, and discussions of previously taboo topics, Stalin's purges, forced famines, and the costs of war, became part of public discourse. The nation began to awaken from decades of silence and controlled narrative. Initially, these reforms inspired hope. Citizens and intellectuals welcomed the chance to speak openly, debate, and engage in civic life. Artists, writers, and journalists explored new freedoms, creating a cultural renaissance that questioned previous assumptions and offered fresh perspectives. Political debates emerged within the Communist Party itself, and local elections began to include multiple candidates, signaling a departure from decades of strict one-party control. However, reform unleashed forces that Gorbachev could not fully control. Economic restructuring under perestroika proved difficult. State enterprises struggled to adapt to market-like conditions, shortages worsened, and inflation began to rise. Citizens, long accustomed to predictable supply systems, faced growing uncertainty and frustration. Corruption and informal networks, previously tolerated, now threatened to undermine the limited reforms as state oversight weakened. Simultaneously, glasnost empowered nationalist movements within the USSR. Ethnic republics, long constrained by centralized Soviet authority, began demanding greater autonomy. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, popular movements organized mass demonstrations, singing national songs and reclaiming cultural symbols suppressed for decades. Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and other regions similarly mobilized, pushing for sovereignty and self-determination. The sense of unity that had held the USSR together for decades began to fracture. By the late 1980s, Gorbachev faced mounting challenges. Conservative elements within the Communist Party resisted reforms, fearing the loss of power and the destabilization of the state. Economic hardship deepened as price controls, shortages, and declining industrial output created widespread dissatisfaction. Citizens, emboldened by newfound freedoms, demanded more radical changes, creating a tension between reformist ambitions and popular expectations. The international context further complicated matters. The Cold War was winding down, and Gorbachev sought to reduce tensions with the West. Arms reduction agreements, including the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signaled a willingness to engage diplomatically, but these concessions were met with suspicion at home. Many Soviet citizens questioned why the government appeared to be ceding international influence while domestic challenges remained unresolved. The tipping point came in 1991. In August, a failed coup by hardline communists attempted to reverse Gorbachev's reforms and restore centralized control. The coup collapsed within days, but it exposed the deep vulnerabilities of the state and the waning authority of the Communist Party. Across the USSR, citizens mobilized in support of reform, flooding streets, organizing demonstrations, and asserting their power in ways unimaginable just a few years prior. Following the coup, constituent republics accelerated their declarations of independence. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia formally left the USSR, followed by Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and others. Nationalist movements were no longer just political movements, they had become mass popular movements with widespread support. The centrifugal forces within the Union became unstoppable. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, acknowledging that the Soviet Union no longer existed. In its place, 15 independent republics emerged, including Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Central Asian nations. The collapse was dramatic but remarkably peaceful compared to other historical disintegrations. Economically and politically, the post-Soviet world faced enormous challenges. Inflation, unemployment, social upheaval, and the restructuring of political institutions became daily realities for citizens navigating the transition. The fall of the Soviet Union was both a liberation and a shock. For many, it marked the end of centralized repression, the possibility of political freedom and new economic opportunities. For others, it brought uncertainty, hardship, and a sudden exposure to the volatility of global capitalism. Long-standing social safety nets vanished, and entire populations struggled to adapt to a rapidly changing world. The story of Gorbachev's reforms and the USSR's collapse illustrates the delicate balance between political power, economic management, and social cohesion. The very policies intended to strengthen the Soviet Union perestroika and glasnost accelerated its disintegration. Nationalism, economic weakness, and the awakening of suppressed civil society combined to dismantle a superpower that had dominated global politics for nearly 70 years. In retrospect, the Gorbachev era represents a paradox. It was a period of immense optimism, creativity, and historical significance, yet it also exposed the fragility of a system that had seemed monolithic and permanent. The reforms demonstrated that even the most centralized and controlled states could be reshaped or undone by the forces of political participation, economic reality, and social aspiration. As the world entered the 1990s, the legacy of Gorbachev's policies continued to shape the post-Soviet landscape. Former Soviet republics faced the dual challenges of building independent political systems and transforming centrally planned economies into market-oriented models. Relations between Russia and its neighbors were redefined, often through tension and negotiation, as newly sovereign states sought to assert identity, control resources, and manage the complex legacies of Soviet rule. For ordinary citizens, the post-Gorbachev era was a period of adjustment, adaptation, and survival. The promises of socialism had vanished, but so too had the predictable security of the Soviet system. Families, communities, and individuals navigated a world of rising prices, changing political structures, and new cultural influences. Some thrived in the new system while others struggled to maintain stability, highlighting the uneven human impact of historical transformation. Ultimately, Gorbachev's tenure and the collapse of the Soviet Union serve as a powerful reminder of the interplay between reform and risk, freedom and fragility, hope and unintended consequences. The experience of the late 1980s and early 1990s demonstrates that no political system, however entrenched, can remain impervious to the pressures of social change, economic reality, and the aspirations of its people. Post-Soviet Russia and the legacy of the USSR 1991, present the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter for Russia and the former Soviet republics. Suddenly, a superpower that had dominated the 20th century was gone, replaced by a constellation of independent nations, each grappling with the challenges of sovereignty, economic reform, and political transformation. Russia, the largest and most influential of these successor states, faced the daunting task of rebuilding its identity, economy, and place in the world. The 1990s in Russia were a time of dramatic upheaval. Boris Yeltsin, elected as the first president of the Russian Federation, introduced sweeping reforms aimed at transitioning the country from a centrally planned economy to a market-based system. Privatization programs transferred state-owned enterprises to private hands, often rapidly and with minimal regulation. While some individuals became immensely wealthy, forming the class of oligarchs that would dominate Russian business and politics, many ordinary citizens suffered. Inflation skyrocketed, pensions and wages lagged, and shortages of essential goods became a daily struggle. Social consequences were severe. Unemployment, previously unheard of in the Soviet system, became widespread. Crime rates surged, fueled by economic dislocation and weakened state authority. Public services, including healthcare and education, struggled to adapt to the new realities of reduced state funding. The shock of rapid transition left a population that had spent decades in a predictable, if constrained, system disoriented and anxious. Politically, Russia faced instability as Yeltsin struggled to consolidate power and navigate the tension between reformers and entrenched Soviet-era bureaucrats. The 1993 constitutional crisis, a violent confrontation between Yeltsin and the Russian parliament, highlighted the fragility of the new political system. Tanks rolled through the streets of Moscow, and hundreds were killed as the state asserted control, setting a precedent for the centralization of authority that would define future governance. The 1990s also saw Russia confronting regional conflicts that tested the unity of the Federation. The First Chechen War 1994-1996 erupted as the Chechen Republic sought independence. The conflict was brutal, with widespread destruction in Chechnya, massive civilian casualties, and humiliating setbacks for Russian forces. Although a ceasefire was eventually reached, the war left deep scars on both Russian society and the federal government, highlighting the difficulties of managing diverse regions with strong local identities. Amid the turbulence, Russia sought to redefine its international role. The post-Cold War world presented opportunities and challenges. Russia joined international organizations, established diplomatic ties with Western nations, and sought integration into the global economy. Yet economic weakness, political instability, and a perception of declining influence led to tensions with former Soviet neighbors and caution in foreign policy. The shadow of the USSR loomed large, influencing both domestic identity and international relations. By the early 2000s, the rise of Vladimir Putin marked a new phase in Russian history. Putin, a former KGB officer, promised stability, economic growth, and the restoration of Russian influence. Centralized authority increased, and the state reasserted control over key industries, particularly in energy and natural resources. Economic reforms, combined with rising oil prices, fueled growth, rising living standards, and renewed confidence in the Russian state. Under Putin, political freedoms became more constrained. Media outlets critical of the government were curtailed. Opposition figures faced legal challenges or persecution, and the political landscape became dominated by a single party aligned with the Kremlin. Yet many Russians, recalling the chaos and hardship of the 1990s, accepted or even welcomed this consolidation of power in exchange for stability and economic security. The post-Soviet era also brought cultural and societal change. Globalization introduced Western consumer goods, entertainment, and ideas, reshaping daily life in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Meanwhile, older generations retain nostalgia for the USSR, often idealizing social security, employment guarantees, and national pride. This duality between embracing modernity and longing for the certainties of the past defined the Russian cultural landscape. Internationally, Russia's post-Soviet trajectory has been complex. Conflicts in Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria, as well as involvement in global energy politics, reflect a nation asserting itself on the world stage while grappling with internal challenges. Relations with Western powers oscillate between cooperation and confrontation, influenced by historical memory, geopolitical interests, and differing political ideologies. The legacy of the Soviet Union remains deeply embedded in Russian society. Education systems, scientific institutions, and industrial infrastructure retain Soviet foundations. Collective memory of World War II, technological achievements like the space program, and the ideological narrative of socialism continue to shape national identity. Even as political and economic systems have changed, the USSR's imprint on culture, governance, and societal expectations is undeniable. Socially, the post-Soviet era has been marked by contrasts. While wealth and opportunities have increased for some, disparities remain stark. Healthcare, education, and regional development vary widely, reflecting both the challenges of transition and the legacies of Soviet centralization. Religion and civil society, suppressed under Soviet rule, have experienced resurgence, adding new dimensions to public life and community identity. The experience of ordinary citizens in post-Soviet Russia reflects resilience and adaptation. Families navigated economic uncertainty, communities created informal networks of support, and cultural life flourished in both official and underground forms. Literature, film, and the arts explored themes previously censored, while nostalgia for the Soviet era persisted alongside aspirations for modern prosperity. By the 2010s and 2020s, Russia had stabilized economically and politically under Putin, yet new challenges emerged. Demographic decline, regional inequalities, international sanctions, and technological transformation highlighted ongoing vulnerabilities. The memory of the Soviet Union remained a source of pride, debate, and historical reflection, influencing policy, education, and international perception. In historical perspective, the post-Soviet era underscores the complexities of transformation. The collapse of a superpower created opportunities for political freedom, economic innovation, and cultural revival, but also unleashed instability, inequality, and regional tensions. The balance between continuity and change, between memory and adaptation, defines Russia's ongoing journey. The broader legacy of the Soviet Union also shapes the world. Its influence extended far beyond its borders, impacting global politics, the spread of socialism, and the ideological battles of the 20th century. Former Soviet republics continue to navigate independence, identity, and economic development within a framework shaped by decades of centralized governance, industrialization, and geopolitical ambition. Ultimately, the story of post-Soviet Russia is inseparable from the history of the USSR. It is a tale of ambition and struggle, of resilience and adaptation, of dreams and unintended consequences. For historians, citizens, and the world at large, the rise and fall of the Soviet Union and its aftermath offers enduring lessons about power, ideology, society, and the human capacity to endure and rebuild amidst profound change. As the 21st century unfolds, Russia and the former Soviet states continue to grapple with these legacies, balancing nostalgia with progress, memory with innovation, and sovereignty with global interconnection. The story of the USSR is not simply a tale of the past, it is a living narrative, shaping politics, society, and culture, and reminding us that history is both a foundation and a compass for the future.